In a remote village nestled deep within the Carpathian mountains, there exists a dark, almost forgotten piece of history, an eerie story so strange it feels like something out of a Gothic novel. In the year 1761, this isolated village imposed an unprecedented ban on birthdays, forbidding its residents from acknowledging or celebrating their own existence in any celebratory manner. At first glance, it seems like a bizarre cultural anomaly, one that could easily be dismissed as an outlier in the grand sweep of history. But upon closer examination, the story becomes even more disturbing, revealing not just the strange behaviors of an isolated community but a much darker reflection on the power of social control, fear, and the shadowy figures that shape their lives. To modern eyes, birthdays are a universal celebration, a rite of passage, a personal milestone marked by cake, candles, gifts, and the warm embrace of family and friends. It's a time when society acknowledges the individual, a day set aside for someone to be recognized, loved, and celebrated for simply being. But in this village, the very idea of a birthday became a forbidden act. No festive gatherings, no joyous congratulations, no community recognition. The ban didn't just touch one person, it affected every villager, ensuring that, at least for one day each year, no one could feel special, no one could feel recognized. The spirit of celebration that marked birthdays in every other corner of the world was, in this place, replaced by a deep, all-encompassing silence. How could something so innocuous, something as harmless as celebrating the day of one's birth, become a social crime? The question lingers, unanswered, as the years pass, the village and its people growing increasingly entrenched in the bizarre and oppressive system that stifled the simplest human joys. What force, what power, was behind the decree, and what did it reveal about the society in which this bizarre prohibition took root? In exploring the roots of this strange decree, we must first understand the context of the time and place in which it arose. The Carpathian Mountains, with their towering peaks and deep valleys, had long been a land of isolation and mystery. Situated at the crossroads of several empires, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, this region was a cultural melting pot, home to diverse peoples, languages, and customs. However, for all its diversity, the region was also steeped in a heavy atmosphere of superstition, secrecy, and fear. The harsh environment and the looming presence of powerful empires made life in these mountains harsh, unpredictable, and often dangerous. People were accustomed to looking over their shoulders, to fearing forces beyond their control, whether they were invading armies, religious authorities, or supernatural powers. In this environment, where power and fear were inextricably linked, the village that banned birthdays became something of an anomaly, an extreme manifestation of a culture that was already rife with suspicion and control. But even then, it's hard to understand how something as personal and universally celebrated as a birthday could be regarded as a threat. What could have motivated the leaders of this community to take such a drastic step, to suppress something so inherently human? It would take us deeper into the history of the village, the politics of the time, and the strange power dynamics that existed between the villagers and the authorities. One possibility is that the birthday ban had less to do with birthdays themselves and more to do with the larger issue of personal identity. In many societies throughout history, individualism was viewed with suspicion. Identity, after all, was not something to be proudly displayed, but rather something to be subsumed within the collective will of the community. In this village, where a tightly knit social order was paramount, a personal celebration might have been seen as an affront to the social fabric. In a time when the state or church controlled so much of everyday life, any act of individual celebration might have been viewed as a challenge to the established order. To allow people to celebrate their birthdays, to focus on their own existence, could be seen as encouraging egoism and self-importance, both of which threatened the conformity that kept the village functioning. There's also the possibility that the authorities saw birthdays as a symbol of defiance. In the Carpathian region, where tensions between empires and local communities were high, celebrating something as private as a birth could have been seen as an expression of independence, an assertion of personal sovereignty. Those in power may have feared that, if people could celebrate the day of their birth, they might begin to celebrate other acts of personal freedom, or worse, question their authority altogether. The ban, then, might not have been about the birthdays themselves, but about ensuring that the villagers remained obedient, subjugated to the will of those in control. Another critical element to consider is the role of religion. In this era, the Catholic Church, especially in regions like the Carpathians, held immense power over people's lives. The Church had a significant say in what was considered morally acceptable and what was not. Religious leaders, in their pursuit of spiritual purity, may have seen birthday celebrations as a form of paganism or hedonism, something that distracted from the solemnity of religious devotion. Birthdays, with their focus on individual life rather than divine will, could have been viewed as a dangerous distraction, one that detracted from the sacred rites and ceremonies that govern the lives of the faithful. To ban birthdays would be to reaffirm the idea that everything, including one's own existence, was subordinate to the will of God and the teachings of the Church. As we dig deeper into the village's history, we begin to encounter the psychological toll the birthday ban took on its residents. The idea of forbidding a birthday celebration, of stripping people of their right to acknowledge their own existence in a meaningful way, was not just a political or religious act, it was a deeply personal affront. For children, in particular, birthdays were milestones of growth and development. They were times for excitement, for feeling loved and cared for understanding that their lives mattered. To deny children the joy of a birthday celebration was to crush their sense of self-worth, to communicate to them that their existence was not worth acknowledging. As for the adults, the ban would have had its own set of psychological effects. Without birthdays, there was no opportunity to reflect on the passage of time, on one's own growth, on the successes and failures that marked a life. People in the village would have been forced to live in a perpetual present, without the normal markers that allow individuals to track the passage of their lives. In many ways, this erased not just individual milestones, but the very act of individual thought. For a community that had already been stripped of many freedoms, the ban on birthdays would have been the final blow to their personal autonomy. The eerie silence that descended upon the village on every birthday was not simply a sign of obedience, it was a reflection of a deep societal sickness, a reflection of a community that had been suffocated by its rulers and by its own fear. The birthday ban was not just a policy, it was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that could only be understood through the lens of power, fear, and the need for control. Today, as we look back at this strange chapter in history, it's difficult to understand how a simple act, celebrating the day you were born, could become a crime. But in the context of the Carpathian Mountains in 1761, it was more than just a simple act of defiance. It was a dangerous challenge to the very social order that kept the community in check. And though the village has faded into obscurity, the echoes of its story still resonate, a reminder of how easily power can strip away the most basic human joys. The Carpathian Mountains, a majestic range that stretches across Central and Eastern Europe, are as captivating as they are foreboding. These mountains, often shrouded in mist and mystery, form the spine of a region where legend and history intertwine, where tales of ancient kingdoms, forgotten peoples, and supernatural forces abound. To understand the significance of the village that banned birthdays, we must first look at the unique backdrop provided by the Carpathians, a place where isolation and superstition went hand in hand, and where history was written not only by kings and emperors but also by the very land itself. The Carpathians run through several countries: Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary, each region bringing its own history, culture, and traditions to the range's already complex fabric. However, one of the most striking features of the Carpathian Mountains is the isolation they afforded those who lived within their rugged terrain. Unlike the more accessible plains or valleys, the villages nestled within the Carpathians were often cut off from the outside world, physically separated by impassable peaks and thick forests. This geographical isolation bred a distinct sense of separateness, a feeling that the people of these villages were untouched by the politics of faraway kings or the military conquests of foreign empires. For the villagers, life was lived according to the rhythms of the mountain and the forest, shaped by age-old traditions that had been passed down for generations. But this isolation also meant that the villagers were often at the mercy of the power structures that surrounded them. In the 18th century, when the story of the village with the birthday ban unfolded, the Carpathians were a patchwork of territories and principalities. The Austro-Hungarian Empire loomed large in the west, while the Ottoman Empire held sway over parts of the east. Between them, smaller nations, including the Kingdom of Hungary and the Principality of Transylvania, vied for control. The political climate was one of constant shifting allegiances, territorial disputes, and the ever-present threat of foreign domination. Life was uncertain, with a constant tension between local autonomy and the overarching demands of distant rulers. In this fractured political landscape, the village in question existed in a liminal space, where old customs and ancient beliefs mingled with the forces of empire. The Carpathians were home to a rich tapestry of peoples, including ethnic Hungarians, Romanians, Ukrainians, and Roma, each with their own distinct languages, customs, and religious practices. This diversity was both a strength and a vulnerability. While the villages in the region were often united by shared cultural practices, they were also vulnerable to the impositions of those in power, who might exploit any difference to maintain control. In the 18th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire exerted considerable influence over the Carpathian region. Under the rule of Empress Maria Theresa, the empire embarked on a series of reforms that sought to centralize power and bring the diverse peoples under a unified imperial banner. The reforms were often harsh, imposing taxes, military conscription, and religious orthodoxy on the rural populations. While some of these reforms were intended to modernize the region, they also served to stifle the autonomy of the local population, imposing a system of control that reached into every aspect of life. The village that banned birthdays was no stranger to this centralizing force. It existed under the shadow of imperial authority, yet, at the same time, it maintained a sense of autonomy, rooted in its long-standing traditions. The cultural landscape of the Carpathians at this time was deeply influenced by religion. The majority of the population was either Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, with religious rites and rituals woven into the fabric of daily life. In such a devout environment, any deviation from religious norms could be seen as a direct threat to the social order. The Church, with its centuries-old influence, played a crucial role in maintaining societal stability. In the Carpathians, as in much of Europe, the Church was more than just a religious institution. It was an essential part of the political and social infrastructure. The teachings of the Church shaped everything from daily routines to life milestones, such as births, marriages, and deaths. In this deeply religious context, the very idea of celebrating one's own birthday could have been seen as a form of self-aggrandizement, an affront to the divine order. Birthdays, in a Christian society, were traditionally not celebrated with the same enthusiasm as other life events, such as baptisms or feasts of saints. To celebrate a birthday was, in some sense, to elevate the individual, to place the focus on one's own life rather than on God's will. In a society where humility was highly valued, such a display of personal pride may have been seen as sinful or sacrilegious. Thus, the birthday ban could have been interpreted as an attempt to curb the rise of individualism and reaffirm the community's dependence on the collective, on family, and, most importantly, on the divine. However, while religion played a significant role in shaping the social and cultural landscape, it was not the only force at play. Folk beliefs, superstitions, and ancient traditions held a powerful sway over the villages. The Carpathian region was rich in folklore, with stories of ghosts, spirits, and mystical creatures passed down through generations. The mountains themselves were believed to be inhabited by powerful, otherworldly forces, spirits of the forest, the winds, and the earth. These beliefs were deeply ingrained in the consciousness of the people, shaping their understanding of the world around them and influencing their daily lives in ways that were often hidden from outsiders. The villagers, living in such close proximity to nature, were acutely aware of the unseen forces that governed their lives. The forest, with its dense trees and shadowy underbrush, was not just a source of resources but also a place of mystery and danger. Spirits were believed to reside within the trees, and certain locations within the forest were thought to be cursed. Even the weather, often unpredictable and harsh, was seen as a manifestation of the spirit's will. In this world, where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed thin, birthdays could take on a different significance. Celebrating a birthday might not just be a joyous occasion. It could be seen as tempting fate, as invoking spirits that were best left undisturbed. The people of the Carpathians were also deeply tied to the land, and the rhythms of nature governed much of their lives. Agriculture, livestock, and the changing of the seasons were integral parts of the community's existence. Birthdays, in this context, were far less important than the milestones that marked the cycles of nature, the sowing of crops, the harvesting of grain, the birth of animals. The timing of these events was dictated by the land, not by the whims of an individual. In such a world, the personal celebration of a birthday could be seen as a distraction, a break from the more essential rhythms of life. The village that imposed the birthday ban, then, existed at the intersection of religion, folklore, and the natural world. It was a place where old customs were slowly being eroded by the forces of empire and modernization, yet where the power of ancient traditions still held sway. In this environment, where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were often unclear, the decree to ban birthdays could have been seen as an attempt to maintain social cohesion in the face of encroaching change. It was an attempt to reinforce the collective, to preserve the community's identity in a time of political and social upheaval. The Carpathian Mountains, with their isolation and mystery, provided a unique setting for this strange chapter in history. The village that banned birthdays was not just a product of its time. It was a reflection of the complex interplay between geography, politics, religion, and folklore that shaped life in the region. The forces that led to the ban were not simply the product of one man or one institution, but rather a convergence of influences: imperial power, religious orthodoxy, folk beliefs, and the harsh realities of life in the mountains. In a world where control was tightly held by both human and supernatural forces, the banning of birthdays was just one manifestation of a larger struggle for power, identity, and survival in a rapidly changing world. Before the ban on birthdays was ever imposed, the village in question was much like any other rural settlement in the Carpathian Mountains, with its own rhythm and pace that had evolved over centuries. Life in these mountain villages was often harsh, shaped by the brutal weather and rugged terrain, yet it also had a certain quiet beauty. The villagers, mostly farmers and craftsmen, were deeply connected to the land. Their existence was defined by the seasons, the crops, and the livestock they raised. Time, for them, was not measured by the arbitrary ticking of clocks or the marking of years as we do today. Instead, it was marked by the cycles of nature: planting, harvesting, sowing, and reaping. In this small, tight-knit community, life revolved around survival, but there was also room for joy and celebration, albeit within the confines of tradition and necessity. Birthdays, as we know them today, were not widely celebrated in the Carpathian region during the 18th century, but that doesn't mean the people of this village were unaware of the significance of life milestones. In fact, their celebrations were often more subtle, focused less on the individual and more on the communal and spiritual. Weddings, births, harvest festivals, and the like were occasions when the village would come together, strengthening the bonds of community and family. These events were communal rites, with everyone participating, and thus, no single person stood out above the rest. Life in the village was communal in the truest sense of the word. Most of the people lived in small, modest homes, made of wood or stone, their interior simple but functional, with a fireplace at the center of each home to provide heat and light during the long, cold winters. These homes were not just residences, they were places of work, of gathering, and of shared memories. Families lived close to one another, often in extended households, with multiple generations under the same roof. The boundaries between private and public were blurred, and community life was characterized by collective action, mutual dependence, and shared resources. Children were an integral part of the village's daily life. Though the village may have lacked formal schooling, the younger generation was taught through experience, learning from their elders how to work the land, care for animals, and navigate the complicated web of traditions that governed their lives. The wisdom of the elders was passed down not through books, but through stories, songs, and rituals. Elders were highly respected, as they were seen as the keepers of history, culture, and tradition. Their knowledge of the land, of local folklore, and of practical skills was invaluable, and their word carried weight in both personal matters and community decisions. In this context, the idea of celebrating the individual, especially through the celebration of a birthday, was foreign to the village. Birthdays, in the traditional sense, did not play a major role in the communal life of the villagers. Instead, they marked a private milestone for individuals, often relegated to a family or close-knit gathering. The real celebrations came in the form of religious holidays, harvest festivals, and seasonal events, when the entire village would come together to honor shared traditions and beliefs. These events were about the collective, not the individual, and were rooted in the natural rhythms of life. The harvest festivals, for example, were marked by feasting, dancing, and thanksgiving for the crops that had been grown and gathered. The cycle of nature was something to be respected, and it was in these shared experiences that the village found its sense of meaning. In these early years, there were no oppressive forces to dictate the terms of the villagers' lives. The community existed under a local, feudal system, with a small number of landowners exerting influence over the peasants who worked the land. The local lord, a figure of authority who owned the land on which the villagers lived and worked, held power over matters such as taxes, land distribution, and labor. However, this power was not absolute, and the villagers were able to live relatively free of interference from outside authorities. They had their own systems of governance, often based on ancient traditions and customs, and their leaders were chosen based on respect and communal standing rather than by any formal law or decree. The village was governed by an unwritten code, a series of norms and traditions that had evolved over centuries. These norms, passed down orally from one generation to the next, were more than just guidelines. They were the very foundation of social life. They dictated everything from how work was shared among families to how disputes were settled and what behaviors were considered acceptable. These informal codes helped maintain social order in a community where there were few formal structures of law or government. Respect for authority, whether it came from a religious figure, an elder, or a local leader, was deeply ingrained in the village culture. Religious observance was another cornerstone of village life. While many villages practiced folk religions or held to pagan traditions, Christianity, particularly Catholicism, held a central place in their worldview. Church services, which were often held in a small, rustic chapel in the center of the village, were a place of both spiritual solace and social gathering. The church, led by a priest, was a focal point for the community, where people gathered not only for prayer but also for social events, feasts, and communal gatherings. While the church may have been a spiritual institution, it also played an integral role in shaping the social fabric of the village. It reinforced the collective identity of the villagers, binding them together through shared beliefs and rituals. However, the fact that the villagers lived such tightly knit lives did not mean that all was peaceful or harmonious. Like any community, tensions occasionally arose. Disagreements over land, disputes between families, or even conflicts over the correct interpretation of religious doctrine could disrupt the delicate balance that held the village together. However, such conflicts were typically resolved through negotiation, with respect for the elders' wisdom and a deep-rooted understanding of the importance of maintaining social order. The community's survival depended on cooperation, and as such, personal grievances were often set aside in favor of the greater good. The sense of individuality, which was so prevalent in other parts of the world, was subdued in the village. Individualism, in the eyes of the villagers, was not seen as a virtue. Rather, the focus was on community well-being, the survival of the group as a whole. Birthdays, then, were not an occasion for individuals to stand apart from the collective. They were not an event for public celebration. To celebrate oneself in this way was considered a deviation from the norm, an indulgence in self-interest that could disrupt the harmony of the community. This was the worldview the village operated under, and the practice of individual recognition had no place in it. Even though birthdays were not celebrated in the village, it is not to say that the people were without a sense of celebration. Life was full of other moments, weddings, religious festivals, seasonal feasts, that allowed the villagers to express joy and gratitude. These celebrations, however, were communal in nature, centered on collective achievements and blessings, rather than on the life of a single individual. The milestones of life, such as marriage or the birth of a child, were marked by community involvement, and the joy was shared equally among all. At this point in the village's history, it was an example of a society that had not yet been deeply influenced by external forces. Its customs were rooted in the land, in the cycle of nature, and in the ancient traditions passed down through generations. The imposition of a ban on birthdays was not a result of foreign conquest or oppression, but rather an extension of the deeply held belief in community over individuality. It was this worldview, deeply embedded in the cultural psyche of the villagers, that would soon be tested in ways they could not have foreseen. The decree to ban birthdays in this isolated Carpathian village, issued in 1761, remains one of the most perplexing and unsettling chapters in its history. The question of how such a seemingly innocuous tradition, celebrating the birth of a person, could become a forbidden act is a mystery that still resonates today. To understand this ban, we must first delve into the events that led up to it, the figures who made it happen, and the ways in which it was enforced. Behind the decree lay an intricate web of political, religious, and social forces that shaped the village's fate. At the heart of the story lies a figure whose authority was both revered and feared, the village leader, a man whose influence over the lives of his people was unmatched. Little is known about his exact identity, but his role as the one who issued the ban is central to understanding why such an extreme measure was taken. It is important to remember that during this time, the Carpathian region was under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and local leaders often held power that extended far beyond what we would consider acceptable in today's world. These leaders were granted significant control over the everyday lives of the villagers, from matters of land distribution to personal rights and social customs. This village leader, whether a nobleman or a local authority placed in power by imperial decree, saw in the celebration of birthdays a threat to the fabric of society. His reasons for imposing such a ban may have been a combination of personal beliefs, social ideology, and perhaps even political maneuvering. The decision to ban something as universal as a birthday celebration seems almost unfathomable, yet in the context of a society where every aspect of life was regulated and controlled, it was not as unusual as it might seem. To understand why, one must consider the broader social environment of the time. The 18th century was a period of intense social and political upheaval. In the Carpathians, as in much of Europe, the centuries-long dominance of feudal systems was beginning to shift, and with it came the rise of centralizing powers. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, under Empress Maria Theresa, had embarked on a series of sweeping reforms aimed at consolidating power, modernizing the state, and imposing uniformity across its diverse territories. These reforms were often met with resistance, particularly in the more remote and traditional regions like the Carpathians, where the influence of the crown was still tenuous and local customs held greater sway. In such an environment, any deviation from the established order was seen as a potential challenge to the empire's authority. Birthdays, in this context, may have been viewed as an expression of individuality, a gesture of personal autonomy that could undermine the tightly controlled social structure that the empire sought to create. The idea of celebrating one's personal existence could be interpreted as a subtle rebellion against the collective spirit of the community. The village leader, tasked with ensuring the stability of the village under the watchful eye of the empire, may have viewed the celebration of birthdays as a sign of personal pride and independence that threatened the delicate balance of his authority. But beyond the political dimensions, there were also deeply rooted religious beliefs that may have contributed to the decision to ban birthdays. The Carpathian region, with its mix of Catholic and Orthodox traditions, was deeply influenced by the teachings of the Church. Religious leaders, as much as local rulers, wielded considerable power over the day-to-day lives of the villagers. In many parts of Europe at the time, the Church played a central role in dictating the moral and social norms that governed behavior. For centuries, Christianity had taught that self-celebration and self-aggrandizement were sinful, particularly in a society that placed a strong emphasis on humility and submission to the will of God. In this light, a birthday celebration, a day focused entirely on an individual, where the self was acknowledged and celebrated, could easily have been seen as an affront to the teachings of the Church. Birthdays could have been perceived as an expression of personal vanity, an act of pride that placed too much focus on the individual, rather than on the community or on divine grace. Religious leaders, whether Catholic or Orthodox, would have viewed such celebrations with suspicion, seeing them as distractions from the true purpose of life, devotion to God and service to the community. It's likely that the village leader, being a figure of both political and religious authority, saw the birthday celebration ban as a way to align the community more closely with the moral expectations of the Church. In a time when the power of the Church was deeply entrenched in everyday life, it is entirely possible that the leader acted in part as an agent of religious authority, enforcing the will of the Church as much as that of the state. By eradicating personal celebrations, he would have been reinforcing the idea that individual life should not be celebrated outside of the spiritual context. Birthdays, by their very nature, celebrated the individual's existence, and in doing so, they may have contradicted the Church's teachings about humility and the primacy of collective worship. Enforcing the birthday ban was not simply a matter of issuing a decree and expecting compliance. It required the full cooperation of the local authorities and the Church. These figures were tasked with ensuring that the community adhered to the new social order, and they had the means to impose discipline. Punishments for defying the ban were likely severe. While the specifics of the enforcement are not well documented, it is easy to imagine a scenario in which those who continued to celebrate birthdays, perhaps even in secret, were subject to public shaming, fines, or even more brutal retribution. The fear of retribution was often enough to silence opposition, and in such a tight-knit, isolated community, the social pressure to conform would have been immense. The village leader likely relied on a network of informants, trusted members of the community who would report any violations of the ban. In a society where the majority of people lived under constant surveillance, both from their peers and from the authorities, breaking such a prohibition would have been risky. People lived in small homes, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. Neighbors watched one another, and even the smallest deviation from the social norm would have been noticed. The isolation of the village may have made it difficult to escape the reach of the authorities. If someone were caught breaking the ban, the consequences would have been severe, both for the individual and for their family. The social cohesion of the village was fragile, and any act of rebellion could tear at the delicate fabric that held the community together. The ban on birthdays was not just a simple decree, it was a mechanism of control. It was an attempt to crush any sense of individuality, to strip away personal identity and force the villagers to adhere to a collective mindset. In a world where power was often maintained through fear and conformity, the banning of something as innocuous as a birthday celebration was a way to remind the villagers of their place in the social order. It was a clear message that they were not to draw attention to themselves, to make themselves stand out, or to celebrate their personal achievements. Their lives were to be lived in submission to the will of the authorities, whether those authorities were secular or religious. In the years following the imposition of the ban, the villagers would have been forced to internalize this new reality. Birthdays were no longer a time for celebration, but a time for silence and compliance. This shift in the cultural and social fabric of the village would have left deep scars, not just on those who lived through it, but on the generations that followed. The very act of recognizing one's existence, of celebrating the life they had lived, had been suppressed, replaced by an atmosphere of fear, control, and silence. The consequences of such an act would echo throughout the village for years to come, leaving a lasting legacy on its people and its culture. The effects of the birthday ban on the villagers went far beyond the mere absence of celebrations. It was a deep, pervasive force that altered the very fabric of their social lives, psychological well-being, and sense of identity. The ban, initially imposed as a seemingly innocuous regulation, became a tool of control that suppressed personal expression, isolated individuals, and slowly eroded the sense of self-worth that is so essential to human beings. The psychological impact on the people who lived under such a decree was profound, creating a climate of fear and repression that rippled through the generations. To begin to understand the psychological consequences of the birthday ban, we must first consider what birthdays represent in any culture. They are, at their core, a celebration of the individual, a recognition of one's existence, growth, and place in the world. Birthdays are milestones that allow people to reflect on their past, anticipate their future, and feel a sense of accomplishment. The act of marking the passage of time in such a personal way affirms one's identity and provides a sense of continuity. Birthdays are not just about cake and presents. They are about affirming the self, acknowledging one's role in the world, and being celebrated by others for the unique journey one has undertaken. For the villagers, the prohibition of this simple act of personal acknowledgement was nothing short of a denial of their identity. They were told, in no uncertain terms, that they were not important enough to be celebrated. The very essence of their individuality was muted, and the sense of personal achievement that usually accompanies the passage of time was crushed. Children, in particular, suffered the most from this. In a society where communal celebrations like weddings or harvest festivals were common, the absence of birthdays left a void in the emotional and social development of the young. Without the opportunity to celebrate personal milestones, they were left without an essential part of their growing up process. For children, birthdays were a time to feel loved, to feel seen, to understand that they mattered. The ban stripped away that sense of personal validation, leaving many children to grow up feeling invisible. The emotional and psychological toll was compounded by the environment of fear and surveillance that pervaded the village. With such a strict rule in place, the villagers had to constantly be aware of their behavior, aware of the ever-present gaze of authority. This constant pressure to conform created an atmosphere of paranoia, where every action, every word, was scrutinized for signs of defiance. The birthday ban was not just a law, it was a way of life, and the fear of being caught breaking it was ever present. People were afraid to express any form of personal joy, even in private, because they knew that doing so could lead to punishment or public shame. For those who dared to break the ban, the consequences could be severe. The social fabric of the village was built on mutual observation and conformity, and anyone who strayed from the norm risked being ostracized, punished, or worse. In such a climate, the psychological effects were insidious. Over time, the villagers internalized the ban, making it not just an external law but an internalized belief that their lives were not worth celebrating. This internalization of repression often leads to what psychologists call learned helplessness, a state in which individuals come to believe that they have no control over their circumstances and that their efforts to change their situation are futile. In this village, the birthday ban worked like a psychological hammer, slowly breaking down the villagers' sense of agency. They were conditioned to believe that their individual lives had no inherent value, that the celebration of their personal milestones was not only unnecessary but possibly sinful. This had a long-lasting impact on how they viewed themselves and their role within the community. For adults, the absence of birthdays was equally damaging. While children were denied the emotional support and validation that come with a birthday celebration, adults were deprived of a sense of personal reflection and accomplishment. Birthdays are often moments when people look back on their achievements, assess their progress, and consider their future goals. Without this ritual, adults were left without an important opportunity for self-reflection. In a time when personal achievements were often the only measure of success in a life filled with hardship, the birthday served as a moment to feel pride and fulfillment. Without it, the The villagers were left in a constant state of emotional deprivation, unable to validate themselves in a world that already offered them few opportunities for personal growth. The psychological toll was also felt in the way the villagers interacted with one another. Social bonds were fractured by the absence of personal celebrations. Birthdays are not only a time for personal reflection but also for sharing joy with others. They are moments when family members and friends come together to celebrate the person in their lives. The birthday ban stripped the villagers of this communal expression of joy, leaving them with fewer opportunities to forge deep emotional connections. In a society where individual lives were already closely tied to the collective, birthdays were one of the few personal milestones that allowed for an expression of individual worth within a larger social context. The lack of birthdays, then, did not just isolate individuals emotionally, it isolated the community as a whole. This social fragmentation created an environment where relationships were stifled, and genuine emotional connections became harder to maintain. The villagers were not allowed to celebrate one another, to express affection and appreciation in the form of a birthday party, a gift, or a simple congratulatory wish. Instead, their relationships were defined by duty, by compliance, and by the constant surveillance of authority. This led to a community where joy was stifled, and emotional intimacy was rare. People may have lived in close quarters, but they were emotionally distant, each person locked in their own world, unable to express their true feelings for fear of attracting attention or punishment. The long-term psychological effects of this repression can also be seen in the way the villagers would have viewed themselves as parents. Without the tradition of celebrating birthdays, how would they raise their children? How would they teach them to value themselves, to feel proud of their existence? It's likely that, in the absence of birthdays, these parents would have turned to other methods to express love and care, but these would have been deeply constrained by the atmosphere of fear and control. The parental role, which in many cultures is a nurturing one, would have been overshadowed by the need to conform and obey. This would have made it difficult for parents to impart a healthy sense of individuality to their children, reinforcing a culture of silence and suppression. As the generations passed, the absence of birthdays would have had a cumulative effect. Children who grew up without the opportunity to celebrate their birthdays would have internalized the belief that they were not worthy of personal recognition, that their lives were not significant enough to be marked by a celebration. As they became adults, they would have passed this same belief onto their children, perpetuating a cycle of repression and emotional deprivation. The village, over time, became a place where personal joy was not just rare, it was almost forbidden. In the broader context, the birthday ban was not just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern of social control that permeated the lives of the villagers. It was an attempt to regulate not just behavior but emotions, to dictate not just actions but feelings. By suppressing one of the most basic and universal human experiences, the recognition of life itself, the authorities hoped to maintain control over the villagers' identities, their sense of self, and their connection to one another. In doing so, they not only stripped the villagers of their right to personal celebration, but they also severed the deep emotional ties that are necessary for a healthy, functioning community. The legacy of this repression lingered long after the birthday ban was lifted. Even as the village returned to a semblance of normality, the psychological scars remained. The villagers may have been free from the official prohibition, but the emotional damage caused by years of suppression would have taken much longer to heal. And in many ways, the ban's true consequences were not visible until much later, when the next generation, raised in an atmosphere of emotional repression, began to grapple with their own identities. The birthday ban, which had seemed like a simple and arbitrary act of control, turned out to be one of the most insidious forms of social control. It altered the very way the villagers saw themselves, and it changed the way they related to one another in profound and lasting ways. As the years passed, the impact of the birthday ban began to reverberate through the village in subtle yet profound ways. On the surface, life continued as usual. People still worked the land, raised families, and followed the customs that had defined their existence for generations. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy, something had shifted. The ban had imposed a psychological weight on the villagers that they could not simply shake off, no matter how much time passed. The suppression of personal celebration, of individual acknowledgement, had left deep scars on the community's collective consciousness. And as the world outside the Carpathians slowly began to change, so too did the dynamics within the village, setting the stage for a transformation that would eventually lead to the slow dismantling of the birthday ban. One of the first signs of change came from the younger generations. Growing up in a village where birthdays were not acknowledged or celebrated, they began to question the wisdom of such a tradition. Children, who had been taught to suppress their own sense of importance and to conform to the collective will of the community, began to experience a sense of dissatisfaction as they reached adulthood. They had never been given the opportunity to celebrate their personal milestones, and as they grew older, the void left by this absence became more apparent. The desire for individuality, something that had been systematically stifled by the authorities, began to rise to the surface. The question of "why can't I celebrate my own life?" began to echo quietly among the younger villagers. This internal yearning for personal recognition was not just a rebellious impulse, it was an inherent part of being human. To have one's existence acknowledged, to be seen and celebrated for one's achievements and growth, is a fundamental part of self-esteem and identity. The birthday ban, by denying this simple right, had inadvertently created a generation of villagers who were emotionally stunted, unsure of how to navigate the complex terrain of self-worth. As the younger villagers came of age, they began to challenge the old social order in subtle ways, searching for ways to assert their individuality without breaking the law or attracting the attention of the authorities. At first, these challenges were small, almost imperceptible. Instead of holding a traditional birthday party, some young people began to quietly mark the occasion in private, perhaps with close family members or even in secret. A small gesture, a gift exchanged under the table, or a whispered happy birthday in the corner of a room was enough to begin the process of reclaiming something that had been denied for so long. These quiet acts of rebellion were not bold statements or public declarations. They were whispers in the dark, an unspoken acknowledgement that life, and personal recognition, still mattered. Over time, these acts of quiet defiance grew. They began to catch the attention of others, particularly among those who had grown disillusioned with the oppressive environment of the village. For years, the birthday ban had been imposed with an iron fist, but as the younger generation began to push back, cracks began to appear in the social fabric. The authorities, whose primary concern was maintaining order and control, began to struggle with the growing desire for personal expression. The very thing they had worked so hard to suppress, the individuality of the villagers, was starting to resurface, and they found themselves in a battle they had not anticipated. The shift was subtle at first, but it was undeniable. More and more young people began to gather in secret, exchanging stories about the outside world and about the ways in which other cultures celebrated their lives. The village, which had once been so isolated, began to feel the pull of the larger world. News of events beyond the Carpathians reached the villagers, slowly but surely, as trade routes were established and travelers from far-off lands passed through the area. Stories from other parts of Europe, where birthdays were celebrated with fanfare and joy, planted seeds of curiosity in the minds of the younger generation. The outside world, which had once seemed so distant and foreign, began to intrude upon the insular life of the village. The empire that had imposed the birthday ban was, at the time, experiencing its own internal struggles. The political landscape was shifting, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a powerful force, was beginning to face increasing resistance from its various territories. While the villagers themselves may not have been aware of the larger political changes sweeping through Europe, they could feel the tension in the air. The old order was weakening, and with it came an opportunity for change. The young people of the village, inspired by the stories they had heard and by the whispers of rebellion that spread like wildfire through their ranks, began to take matters into their own hands. They saw in the outside world the possibility of a life where they could be free to express themselves, to celebrate their own lives without fear of punishment. The birthday ban, which had once been an unassailable decree, was now seen as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old system, a system that sought to control not just actions, but thoughts and feelings. With time, the birthday ban became less a matter of public law and more a point of contention, something that people discussed in hushed tones, something that could no longer be accepted without question. The authorities, who had once wielded such power, were finding it harder and harder to suppress the growing desire for individuality. As the younger generation began to question the legitimacy of the ban, they found themselves in a delicate balancing act, trying to assert their rights without provoking the wrath of the village leader or the local church. Despite the increasing tension, the authorities held on to their grip for a time. The older villagers, who had lived their entire lives under the ban, were hesitant to challenge the established order. For them, the prohibition was a part of their world, and the idea of defying it was not something they could easily accept. Many still believed in the righteousness of the ban, convinced that it was in place for the greater good of the community. For them, birthdays were still a dangerous expression of selfishness, a reminder of a world outside their own that had no place in the tightly knit Carpathian society. But the younger generation, emboldened by their growing sense of self, was not content to accept the status quo. They had witnessed the world beyond their mountains, and they were determined to bring the celebrations of life into their own village. The tension between the old and new ways of thinking grew palpable. The birthday ban, once a matter of unquestioned authority, had become a symbol of resistance and rebellion, a rallying cry for those who sought to reclaim their personal identity. The eventual collapse of the birthday ban came not in a single moment of defiance, but as part of a larger, inevitable process of change. The villagers, having been denied their individuality for so long, were no longer willing to live in silence. Over time, the forces of tradition began to lose their grip on the community, and the pressures from within and outside the village became too great to ignore. The authorities, unable to maintain control, began to loosen their hold on the practice, and slowly but surely, birthdays began to be recognized again, if only in small, private ways at first. It was a gradual process, one that unfolded over decades rather than days, but in the end, the birthday ban was no longer a part of daily life in the Carpathian village. The people, having lived in a world where their existence was once rendered invisible, slowly began to reclaim their right to be seen. The celebration of life, once a forbidden act, gradually returned to the village, though it would never again carry the same significance it once might have. The scars of repression lingered, but over time, the villagers learned to celebrate not just their personal milestones, but the triumphs of the human spirit that had endured so much. In the years that followed, the village would change dramatically. The forces of modernity and individualism began to shape the community in ways that were once unimaginable. The birthday ban, while no longer enforced, became a story, a piece of the village's history that would be passed down from generation to generation as a reminder of a time when the very act of celebrating life had been suppressed. It would serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring desire to be seen, to be recognized, and to be celebrated for the simple, yet profound act of existing. As the birthday ban gradually receded into the past, the legacy of its oppressive grip on the village lingered far longer than the prohibition itself. The people, though free once again to celebrate personal milestones, found themselves caught in a paradox. While the formal restrictions had been lifted, the deep-seated psychological and social consequences of years of repression didn't disappear overnight. The villagers, particularly those who had lived through the ban's darkest years, found it difficult to shake off the silence that had once been imposed on their lives. They had spent decades conditioned to believe that their individual celebrations, their personal joys, were not only unnecessary but dangerous. The scars of these decades were invisible yet profound, woven into the very fabric of the community psyche. The younger generation, who had come of age during the final years of the ban, faced a different challenge. Though they had never directly experienced the intensity of the ban's enforcement, they grew up in a village where individuality was still treated with suspicion. Their parents and elders, having lived through years of emotional suppression, found it difficult to embrace the new reality. A culture of secrecy and repression had become deeply ingrained, and even as the shackles of the ban were removed, many found it hard to express joy without the shadow of guilt. To celebrate one's own life, after all, had been forbidden for so long that it seemed almost unnatural to do so freely. For the younger villagers, those who had witnessed the emotional toll of the ban on their parents, the challenge was twofold. They had to reclaim their right to celebrate themselves while also trying to heal the wounds inflicted by years of silence. The concept of individual celebration had become foreign to them, like a lost language that needed to be relearned. They struggled to understand what it meant to honor themselves, to mark their existence in a way that was meaningful and joyous. Birthdays, as a simple act of personal acknowledgement, had become a ritual devoid of significance for an entire generation. As the community slowly began to reawaken to the possibility of personal expression, they found that their desire for celebration wasn't just about throwing parties or exchanging gifts. It became a quest for identity. People who had been forced to suppress their individuality for so long had forgotten what it meant to be recognized, not as part of the collective, but as themselves. This need for individual recognition, though subtle, manifested in the way they began to redefine their social roles and relationships. The simple act of saying happy birthday to someone, or gathering a small group of friends and family together, slowly became a revolutionary act, one that allowed them to reclaim their humanity in a society that had long valued conformity over personal joy. But for some, this transition was more complicated. The social structures that had been in place for generations were not easily undone. The elders, particularly those who had been active in upholding the birthday ban, continued to view personal celebration with suspicion. To them, the new practices felt like an affront to the traditions that had long defined the village. The communal identity, which had been so tightly bound by shared rituals and collective effort, now seemed fractured by the very presence of individual joy. The notion of self-celebration felt foreign, perhaps even immoral, to a generation that had been taught to reject the concept of the self as separate from the community. The notion of individual rights, of personal freedom, had not yet taken root in the minds of many, and the old ways were hard to shake. The tension between the old and new ways of thinking created a divide that ran deep through the village. Families were split. Some embraced the idea of personal celebration, seeing it as a healing process, a way of overcoming the trauma of the past. Others resisted, feeling that their children were abandoning the traditions that had once kept the community strong. In some homes, birthday celebrations became a source of conflict, parents and grandparents clinging to their sense of cultural propriety, while the younger generation embraced the novelty of personal acknowledgement and joy. The process of healing and rebuilding a sense of individual worth was slow, and it was never without its difficulties. The villagers had spent years learning to suppress their emotions, to live in a state of emotional restraint that was as much a part of their identity as their customs and rituals. To suddenly embrace the full spectrum of human expression, joy, celebration, personal acknowledgement, was daunting. It wasn't just about throwing a party, it was about rediscovering a fundamental part of what it means to be human, the ability to recognize one's own life and achievements. However, the seeds of change had been planted. The older generations, despite their reservations, began to witness the transformations taking place among the younger villagers. The atmosphere of fear and repression that had once dominated the community was gradually replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. As more and more villagers began to celebrate their birthdays, albeit in small ways at first, the village slowly began to shed its old skin. People who had lived under the shadow of the birthday ban began to find their voices again, expressing themselves in ways that had once been unimaginable. As these new practices took hold, the community found new ways of celebrating life. Birthdays became a time not just for personal reflection, but for communal gatherings where family and friends could celebrate together. The significance of the day was no longer tied solely to the individual. It became a symbol of collective joy. The village began to rediscover what it meant to come together, not just for communal tasks, but to mark the passage of time, to recognize the achievements of both the individual and the community. Birthdays were still seen as deeply personal moments, but they were now shared experiences that brought people closer, bridging the gap between old traditions and new practices. The transformation of the village in the aftermath of the birthday ban was not just about individual celebrations, it was about the reclamation of agency, the recognition of personal value, and the reassertion of human dignity. What had been lost during those dark years was gradually returned, piece by piece, as the villagers learned to celebrate themselves once more. It was a delicate process, a rebuilding of trust in the idea that life, in all its forms, deserved recognition and celebration. The return to personal celebration was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Despite years of suppression, the desire for self-expression and personal acknowledgement had not been eradicated. It had simply been buried, waiting for the right moment to surface. When that moment finally came, it was as though a dam had broken, allowing the flood of joy and recognition to flow freely again. The villagers had learned, perhaps more deeply than many others, that the act of celebrating life, of acknowledging one's own existence, was not a privilege, it was a right. And with that right came a responsibility to honor not just oneself, but the community as well. As the years passed, the village began to undergo a transformation that was not just about personal milestones and individual celebrations, but about the very essence of how people viewed community and self. The ban, which had once stifled joy and individuality, was now a fading memory, but its aftermath continued to shape the village in unexpected ways. The scars left by the prohibition of birthdays ran deep, and while they could not be erased, they began to heal as the villagers slowly reclaimed their right to celebrate their lives. However, this journey toward healing was not without its challenges. The act of celebrating one's existence, which had been forbidden for so long, had to be approached with caution, reverence, and, in some cases, even fear. For the older generation, the process of reintegrating birthday celebrations into their lives was complicated. Many had grown accustomed to the years of emotional restraint, to the quiet acceptance of a life where personal joy and celebration were considered unnecessary. For them, the notion of personal acknowledgement seemed foreign, even wrong. They had spent so long living under the shadow of the ban that it became ingrained in their worldview. To some, birthdays were not just frivolous distractions, they represented a challenge to the community's collective identity. The notion of celebrating oneself, of placing one's own life at the center of attention, was still viewed with suspicion by many who had lived through the ban. However, as the younger generation began to embrace the practice of marking personal milestones, the older villagers started to witness a shift in their community. While they still clung to their deeply ingrained beliefs about collective identity and social conformity, they began to understand that the desire for individual celebration was not inherently selfish. Instead, it was a natural part of being human. It was a way for individuals to acknowledge their place in the world, to reflect on the journey they had taken, and to celebrate the simple fact of their existence. Over time, the older villagers began to see birthday celebrations not as a threat to the social order but as an expression of the resilience of the human spirit. Yet, the process of accepting these new practices was slow and fraught with emotional conflict. For those who had lived through the height of the birthday ban, the idea of celebrating personal milestones was still clouded by guilt. They had been conditioned for years to believe that such celebrations were not just unnecessary but morally suspect. Many older villagers, though they may have eventually accepted the change, struggled with the deep-seated shame that had been instilled in them over the years. The very act of acknowledging their own existence in a public way felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural, and they hesitated to embrace the new norms fully. Meanwhile, for the younger generation, who had never experienced the full weight of the ban, the celebration of birthdays was seen as an opportunity to reclaim something that had been lost, an essential part of their cultural and emotional identity. They did not carry the same burden of guilt and repression as their parents did, and they quickly adapted to the new normal. Birthdays, once again, became a time for friends and family to gather, to express love and gratitude, and to celebrate life. The younger villagers, having grown up in an environment where individual expression was stifled, found great joy in this newfound freedom. They reveled in the ability to express their personal milestones openly and without fear of repercussion. For them, the act of celebration was not just a personal achievement, it was a statement of independence, a small victory against the years of oppression they had witnessed in their parents and elders. In many ways, the return of birthday celebrations marked the beginning of a larger cultural shift within the village. As personal identity became more valued, the collective identity began to change as well. The idea of the community as a singular, unified whole, with no room for individuality, was gradually replaced by a more inclusive and flexible sense of belonging. People began to understand that the strength of the village did not lie in conformity but in the acceptance of diversity, of different personalities and life experiences. The individual stories of each villager, once silenced, began to find their place in the larger narrative of the village's history. This transformation, while gradual, was revolutionary. It marked the beginning of a new era for the village, one where the recognition of individual lives was no longer a source of shame but a vital and celebrated part of their shared existence. This shift was also reflected in the way that the villagers began to interact with one another. Relationships that had once been defined solely by communal obligation began to open up to more personal, emotional connections. The act of celebrating birthdays, of recognizing the individual, began to change the way people related to each other. Family ties, which had always been important, now took on new meaning.